He had dog tags under his shirt and 30 years of service. The officer hadn't looked. Victor Hale pressed both palms flat on the roof of the Ram truck and held the position for 11 seconds without speaking. Not because there was nothing to say, because 30 years of operational service had trained a specific kind of calculation, and the calculation was running. The patrol approach had been fast. The commands had assumed the conclusion before the question was finished. By the time Brian Kell had Victor on the concrete at the Meridian Road Exxon, the count was already running. Not in fear, but in the particular patience of a man who has waited out worse than this, in worse places, and come out the other side, knowing the wait was always finite. The math was already decided. What remained was the time it took for the other party in the situation to catch up. When Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Park stepped out of the green military expedition at 3:44 in full Army dress uniform and looked through the cruiser window at the man seated in the back, she did not say a word. She raised her hand in a regulation salute so precise it stopped every sound in the station. Brian Kell had 12 years on the force. He had spent every one of them operating on a set of assumptions that had just encountered something they were not built to survive. If you've ever watched the moment someone discovers they were completely wrong about who they were looking at, subscribe and keep watching. The real story starts now. Victor Hale had been back in the country for 26 days when they dragged him out of his truck at the Exxon on Meridian Road. He had pulled into the station at 2:15 in the afternoon to fill up the same 2019 Ram pickup he had bought the week he retired. 4 years ago, 30 years of service behind him, the papers signed and the uniform folded, and the life after that still being assembled one ordinary day at a time. The gas pump was authorizing his card when the first patrol car came in hard from the east entrance of the station. Victor did not move quickly. He did not move slowly. He moved with the economy of a man who had made decisions at speed for 3 decades and had learned that urgency without information was its own kind of error. He took both hands off the pump handle and placed them flat on the roof of the truck in one clean motion. He knew the physics of this situation. He had been in the physics of this situation in places whose names he was not permitted to say in rooms without security clearance. And the geometry was always the same. A person with a weapon, insufficient information on both sides, and a need for stillness that was not the same thing as submission. He was wearing a worn olive drab field jacket over a plain gray t-shirt, dark work pants, and the boots he had bought in 2017 and had never found sufficient reason to replace. Under the collar of the t-shirt, flat against the sternum, were his dog tags. He had not removed them in 30 years. The chain had been replaced twice. The tags had not. The second patrol car came in from the west entrance, 30 seconds after the first, and Officer Brian Kell came out of the first car in the forward-leaning stride of a man who had already decided what this situation was before he had gathered sufficient information to decide anything. Victor kept his hands on the roof of the truck. He said, very clearly and without volume, "Sir," one word, establishing the tone he intended to maintain. "I can show you the registration." Brian Kell said something in response that had no relationship to the registration. He said it with the confidence of a man who had said things like it before and had never been corrected. Victor absorbed the specific content and the specific tone and the specific intent of what Brian said, filed all three, and said, "I need you to understand what you are doing right now." He said it with the quality of voice he had used in briefings, in extraction scenarios, in rooms where the accuracy of the next instruction was the variable that determined whether people went home. It did not come out as a plea. It came out as the opening statement of an operational debrief. Victor felt the hand close on his left shoulder before the sentence had finished, and he breathed and did not resist, because resistance in this geometry was the calculation he had already run. And the answer was clear. He was pulled backward from the truck by 2 sets of hands moving in coordination, and his boots made a scuffing sound on the concrete as they left the surface, and he absorbed the motion and stayed steady inside it, because he had learned 30 years ago that the body could be moved without the mind following it, and that this was not defeat, it was strategy, and strategy was the only thing worth having when everything else had been taken. There was enough in that 1 second to establish a significant amount. Victor looked back at the concrete and heard a car at the pump 2 positions over finish its transaction and drive away. The station continued its ordinary business around the extraordinary thing that was happening on its concrete. Victor thought about the word ordinary. He had spent 30 years in places where ordinary did not apply, and he had never once been able to take it for granted. And he did not take it for granted now. He thought about what it meant to be in an ordinary place doing an ordinary thing, and have that ordinary thing interrupted in a way that was both entirely predictable and entirely without justification. He filed the thought in the same place he filed other things that required a different setting to be addressed properly. Brian Kell had Victor's arms secured within 20 seconds and had called in the stop before he had finished conducting it, which was not the procedure Victor had memorized in the binder the department's community liaison had handed him at the Veterans Outreach event 6 months ago, but which was the procedure Brian operated by, which was a different document. Victor was on his knees on the concrete. The concrete was hot from the afternoon sun and slightly textured from years of vehicle traffic, and it pressed into Victor's kneecaps with the particular indifference of a surface that is simply there and does not involve itself in the question of who it is holding. Victor had been on his knees on surfaces worse than concrete in circumstances considerably more serious than a gas station on Meridian Road, and he knew that the ability to think clearly from that position was a skill and not a given, and he practiced it now. He breathed. He kept his spine straight, which was automatic. 30 years of physical training had removed his ability to slouch even under direct pressure. The second officer, the one who had come in from the west, was standing 15 feet back near his cruiser door, with one hand on the door frame and one hand somewhere between his belt and his side. He was watching. Victor watched the second officer watching. There was something in the second officer's posture that was different from Brian's. Something that suggested prior familiarity with a different kind of situation. The specific posture of a body that had once known military protocol and had not fully shed the knowledge. On Victor's left palm, running from the base of the thumb across the heel of the hand and angling toward the inner wrist, there was a scar. Old, pale against the dark skin, thick in the way that scars from specific training situations are thick, deliberate, controlled origin, not the randomness of accident. The right hand carried its own mark, in a different configuration, same general provenance. Victor's hands were flat on the concrete. The second officer had moved away from his car door. He was standing 12 feet back now, and his expression had shifted into something that had not yet resolved itself into a position. Victor looked at him for exactly 1 second. The second officer looked back. Neither of them spoke. The afternoon light came hard and flat across the gas station canopy and made the shadows very specific. Victor thought about the decal. He had not thought about it in months. It was the kind of detail that becomes invisible when it becomes permanent. The same way you stop hearing the ambient noise of a building you work in every day. Victor had driven past restricted checkpoints with that decal visible for 4 years, without anyone needing to ask who he was. Because at those checkpoints, no one needed to ask. He was in a different situation now. He was at a gas station in Virginia in civilian clothes, and Brian Kell had looked at the registration and looked at the name, and had set the registration on the seat of the truck, and had chosen to continue in the direction he was already traveling. And that choice was the one variable Victor could not currently control. He could control his breathing. He could control his posture. He could control what he said and when, and the tone in which he said it. He could not control the pace at which Brian Kell was going to arrive at the conclusion that was waiting for him. Victor decided that the patience required for this was the same kind of patience required for other situations he had waited out successfully. And he had waited those out. And he would wait this out. And the end of the waiting was already built into the structure of what was happening here. Whether Brian Kell understood that yet or not. Brian reached the cab of the Ram at 2:22. He pulled the driver's door open and went directly to the center console, which was the obvious location, and found what he was looking for: green plastic sleeve, registration and insurance, both current, both in order. He picked them up. He looked at the name, Victor James Hale. He looked at it again, as though looking at it twice would change what it said or what it implied. He looked over the door at Victor on the concrete, and then back at the registration, and then at the name again. He said nothing for a moment that was slightly longer than the moment required. Victor watched him through the window glass. Victor said, not loudly, not urgently, in the tone he had used in the specific kind of briefing where the clarity of the instruction was the variable that determined outcomes, "I need you to listen carefully to what I am telling you." Brian looked up from the registration. His expression was the expression of a man who has received new information and has determined that the new information is going to complicate the direction he was already traveling, and has further determined that complication is not sufficient reason to change direction. He set the registration on the seat. On the inside of the windshield, in the lower left corner where the glass met the dashboard, there was a small access decal, rectangular, dark blue, 2 inches by 1 inch, faded at the edges from 4 years of sun and dashboard heat, the kind of decal issued for restricted military installation access. Brian had not looked at the windshield. Brian closed the truck door. He came back around the vehicle and stood looking at Victor on the concrete and said something about cooperation. Victor had not failed to cooperate. Victor breathed and looked at the concrete and thought about the next thing, which was going to be better than this thing, because everything had a next thing, and the next thing was always survivable if you stayed present for the current one. Brian looked at Victor. Something was running behind his eyes that his face was not going to show. Victor had watched that kind of interior recalculation in many faces, in many circumstances, and knew that its outcome was not fixed. Sometimes the recalculation produced a change in direction. More often it reinforced the direction already taken, because the person doing the recalculating had committed too far to the original decision to absorb the new data without compromising a position they had established publicly. Brian's shoulders settled back. Brian had completed his recalculation. Victor looked at the concrete and thought about all the men he had trained and led who had, in conditions more serious than this, run the same recalculation and arrived at the same outcome, and the different results of those outcomes, and what the difference had been. It was not intelligence, not courage, not even experience. It was the willingness to be wrong out loud, in real time, in front of people. That willingness was a specific and teachable skill. Brian did not appear to have been taught it. The second officer's name was Sergeant Tony Reyes, and Reyes had done 2 tours as Army infantry before he came home at 29 and joined the department, and he had been a patrol sergeant for 6 years, and he had been in perhaps 100 situations, and not once in those 100 situations had he felt what he was feeling in this one, which was a specific wrongness that had no precise name but had the quality of something he would not be able to set down later when he tried. He moved closer. He came to stand at Brian's left at a distance of approximately 6 feet, close enough to observe the details of the scene at the level of detail the scene required. Brian was directing Victor to stand. The direction was delivered in the cadence of a man who expected non-compliance, as a matter of course. Victor stood. Victor rose from the concrete in a single clean movement. No assistance, no staggering, no hesitation, with his hands still in the position he had maintained since they were placed there. He came to his full height, which was 6 feet 1, and he stood in the afternoon light with the bearing of a man who had spent 30 years occupying difficult physical positions without surrendering the interior composure those positions were designed to disrupt. Reyes was 5 feet away. At 5 feet, at this angle, in this light, Reyes could see the quality of Victor's stillness clearly. He had seen that quality of stillness once before, in a training briefing video, 6 months into his first year on the force. A video that had shown a special operations officer in a hostage negotiation scenario, a man who had been in the room for 18 hours and had not adjusted his posture once. Victor said very quietly, the single word, son, nothing after it. Just the word, in a tone that contained 30 years of command. Brian Kell heard it. Brian Kell looked at Victor. Something passed between them that Brian did not have a category for, and because Brian did not have a category for it, he reclassified it as insubordination and moved accordingly. Victor looked at the tags for a long time. They were not remarkable in themselves. They were the same shape and size and material as every other pair of identification tags issued by the United States Army in the relevant period. What made them remarkable was context, and the context was invisible to anyone who had not been there. They had been worn in 23 countries, 4 of which Victor was still not permitted to confirm he had ever been in, through conditions that would not be described in any document likely to be declassified in his lifetime. The tags did not carry any of that information in a form a person could read without the context. They were 2 small pieces of metal with numbers. Victor thought that this was approximately true of most important things. The importance was in the context. The context was usually invisible. He settled back and breathed and let the tags catch the light and thought about what was coming. They put Victor in the back of Kell's cruiser at 2:31. Victor did not resist the direction to move. He walked with them and he angled his head at the door frame of the cruiser with the practiced economy of a man who had ducked into and out of military vehicles for 30 years. And he settled into the rear compartment and the door closed. When the door closed, the dog tags shifted. The movement of sitting had drawn the chain, and now 2 inches of chain and the upper edge of both tags were visible above the collar of the gray t-shirt. Catching the afternoon light that came through the cruiser's rear window, Victor looked down at them. He did not tuck them back in. He left them exactly where they had moved to. He looked through the window glass at the ram, still sitting beside the pump, the engine still running on the fuel it had when he pulled in, the card authorization still pending on the pump display. He thought about what it meant to have started a task and been prevented from completing it. He thought about all the tasks he had started and been prevented from completing, and had then completed by other means and through other timelines, because the task did not stop being the task, simply because the path to it had been interrupted. Reyes was standing outside the cruiser. Victor could see Reyes through the glass. Reyes was looking at the dog tags. Victor could see precisely what Reyes was looking at. Reyes had his arms folded across his chest, and the set of his jaw was different from what it had been 20 minutes ago. He was a man trying to locate something in his memory that he knew was there and could not immediately retrieve. Victor looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at Victor. There was no gesture between them. The dog tags caught the light. The pump display blinked its pending authorization message into the afternoon. He was on name 14 when Brian finished his radio transmission in the front seat and the cruiser went quiet. Victor continued. Name 15. Name 16. He was meticulous about the sequence because the sequence was the point. They had been in the sequence together, and they deserved to be remembered in it. Outside, the afternoon light was doing what it did in early fall in this part of Virginia, moving from flat white to something warmer and more angled. The kind of light that changed what it touched very slightly without anything appearing to move. Victor had spent 30 years observing light in difficult places. Desert light was specific. High-altitude bleached, ground-level bronze, the shadows always telling you more than the illuminated surfaces did. Jungle light was layered and unreliable. Urban light was bounced and scattered, and could not be trusted to come from the direction it appeared to come from. The light in this gas station in Virginia was none of those things. It was the ordinary light of an ordinary autumn afternoon, and it was falling on an extraordinary situation, and the light did not appear to know or care about the distinction. Victor found this neither comforting nor troubling. He found it accurate. He continued counting. Name 17. Name 18. Captain Darrell Okafor, Fort Campbell, 2011. The bravest man Victor had ever seen in any room, and the most careful, which were not in his experience the same quality in most people, but had been in Okafor. Name 19. The afternoon held itself still. Inside the cruiser, it was warmer than it needed to be because Brian had not run the air conditioning and the afternoon sun was directly on the vehicle's rear glass. Victor adjusted his position so the cuffs were not applying direct pressure to the base of his spine and then sat very still. He had a practice for confined waiting that he had developed in 2003 in a country he had never publicly been in and had maintained in various forms for the 21 years since. He counted names, not randomly, sequentially, the names of every person who had served in his command in chronological order of their first day under him. The ones who were still there, and the ones who had come home different, and the ones who had not come home. He was on name 11. Sergeant First Class Deshaun Morris, Fort Bragg, 2004, the best breachman Victor had ever seen in his life. When he heard the sound of Reyes outside making a call on a personal phone rather than the radio, not dispatch, Victor registered the distinction. He continued on name 11, names 12 and 13. Outside, Brian Kell was delivering his account to dispatch in the flat sequential manner of a man who has shaped a narrative in real time often enough that the shaping has become automatic. Victor could not hear the words at this distance, only the pattern of them. The specific rhythm of an account that has been organized before the organizing was complete. He knew that rhythm. He had sat in rooms where that rhythm was directed at people who worked for him, and he had learned to identify it from across great distances and through walls and through noise, because identifying it was part of the job of being the man those people reported to. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to angle further west. An hour and 22 minutes had passed since Victor had pulled into this gas station. The truck was still running. The pump was still pending. Brian said something about jurisdiction. Park looked at him with the patience of a person who has heard the word jurisdiction used incorrectly in many formal settings and is no longer capable of surprise at its misapplication. She did not respond to it. Brian said something about proper channels, about the process by which things were handled. Park listened to both sentences with the same expression directed at Brian, which was not contempt and was not anger. It was simply attention, complete and unqualified. The attention of a person whose position has not shifted and will not shift, and who has enough patience to wait for the other person to exhaust the list of things they are going to say before the next step happens. Brian stopped speaking. Reyes had not moved. The afternoon was quiet at the edges of the gas station. The military vehicle turned into the north entrance of the Exxon on Meridian Road at 3:44. It was a dark green government Ford Expedition with military installation plates, and it came in with the unhurried precision of a vehicle that had known its destination before it departed. The driver's door opened. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Park stepped out in full Army service uniform. The blue dress with every element in its correct position, ribbons at the left chest, gold oak leaf cluster at the collar, the beret. The posture of a person who has worn this uniform for 19 years and has made peace with what wearing it requires and what it costs. Park was 42 years old. She had served in Victor's command for the last 11 of those years, and she had received a call from Sergeant Reyes 14 minutes ago on a number Reyes should not have had and had obtained through a lateral channel that said something important about the kind of officer Reyes was. Park scanned the scene in 2 seconds. She had learned to read a scene in 2 seconds from a man who read them in one. Located Victor in the rear of the cruiser and walked directly to the cruiser window. She came to a stop at attention. She looked at Victor through the glass. She raised her right hand to her brow in a full, precise salute and held it. It was not a social gesture. It was the regulation salute of a subordinate officer to a superior officer, executed with complete technical correctness. Brian Kell, who had been standing near the rear of the cruiser, had stopped moving. His hand was still on the radio and he had stopped mid-transmission. Reyes had gone entirely still 6 feet away. Park held the salute for 3 seconds and brought it down and turned to look at Brian Kell. The difference in their heights was 4 inches, and it was irrelevant. "Open the door," she said. She said it with the economy of a person for whom repeating an instruction was a theoretical concept rather than a regular practice. The 4 seconds after the phone call ended, contained more information than many much longer intervals. Brian stood at the open cruiser door with his hands still on the frame, and his body held the specific configuration of someone who has received a piece of information so definitively in conflict with their working model that the body has not yet reorganized itself around the new data. Heck had a hand on Brian's arm, not force, not restraint, the orienting gesture of a senior officer who understood that the scene now required simultaneous management of several things at once. Park did not look at either of them. Victor stepped out of the cruiser and straightened and stood on the concrete in the afternoon light and felt the ordinary sensation of his own feet on a surface, which was not a small sensation after 2 hours. Park came to stand near him. She said quietly, "There would be a formal review." The dashcam footage. Victor said he understood. Park said it had been running before the station, from the previous stop, which meant it had captured the full approach. Victor absorbed this. It meant the encounter existed in complete record from before it began. It meant that the particular version of events that would be offered in the other direction was going to encounter that record, and that the record was not going to move. Victor looked at Park. Park was still looking at Heck and Brian. Her expression had not changed. Brian's supervisor, Captain Lorraine Heck, arrived at 3:52. She had been called by Reyes's personal phone call 14 minutes before Park arrived and had been moving toward the scene since the call. And she came in her own vehicle and parked at the north edge of the lot and got out with the careful expression of a senior officer, approaching a scene she has already partially understood from the phone call, but not entirely. While Heck was still crossing the lot, Park was already on her phone. She had the installation commander on speaker. The commander's voice came through the phone's speaker at a volume audible at 8 feet of distance. Park gave the address and the situation in 6 sentences. The commander asked to speak to Colonel Hale. Park walked to the cruiser, opened the door, held the phone to Victor. Victor took it. The commander said, "Commander Hale, are you all right, sir?" He used the full form of address, the form he used for no one else on the installation, because there was no one else on the installation who held the title. Brian Kell stood at the open cruiser door. He heard the address. He heard the word sir. He heard the specific weight that word carried in the voice of the man on the other end of the phone, a man who outranked everyone at this gas station by a distance that the gas station could not contain. Heck was now at Brian's shoulder. She heard it too. Victor said, "I'm all right, Colonel." "Thank you." He handed the phone back to Park. Park ended the call and looked at Heck. She did not look at Brian. "I need him uncuffed," Park said. Heck said, "Yes, ma'am." 2 words. Immediate, unqualified, and final. Park stayed until the last documentation was completed, and then came to where Victor was standing and told him briefly what the review process would require in terms of a formal statement, which would be taken at a time and location of his choosing. Victor said he understood. Park looked at him for a moment with the particular expression she used when there was more to say that did not belong in a formal setting and would be said somewhere else. Victor had seen that expression in many debriefs. He gave her the same nod he gave in those situations. Park walked back to the expedition. She drove out of the north entrance at the speed of a person who is not behind schedule on anything that matters. Victor stood beside his truck for a moment after the expedition left the lot. He looked at the pump. He looked at the empty space where Kell's cruiser had been parked. He looked at the road to the north, which was open and clear and lit by the specific light of an autumn afternoon that was moving toward evening. He thought about the word ordinary again and what it was worth. He thought about 26 days of being back in a country where the ordinary things were available again. Gas stations, grocery stores, the specific weight of a key in a pocket, a truck you had bought with money you had saved, and that belonged to you without qualification. He decided ordinary was worth considerably more than he had been giving it credit for. He got in the truck. He put it in drive. He drove north. The documentation took 38 minutes, and Victor spent most of them standing beside the ram in the late afternoon light, the pump still sitting in the tank and the card authorization still cycling. the engine running on fumes now. Park finished what she needed to finish. Heck did what she needed to do with Brian, which included separating Brian from the scene to her own vehicle within 6 minutes of the phone call, where they remained for the duration. Reyes stayed on scene. He had not been directed away, and there was no cause to direct him away, because what Reyes had done at this scene was to make 2 decisions: to stay near Brian without participating in what Brian was doing, and to call a number he should not have had at the moment. The calculation required someone to make a call, and both decisions had been the correct decisions, and the record would reflect that. Victor noticed Reyes's continued presence and noted it with the specific attention he gave to small correct decisions made by people in situations where the small incorrect decision was considerably easier to make. When the documentation was complete and the pump had finally timed out its authorization attempt, and the truck's engine had begun to show its fuel light, Victor walked toward the driver's door. He passed Reyes, who was standing at the edge of the cleared area with his hands at his sides, and his face carrying the particular weight of a person who has done a right thing and is in the early stage of understanding that doing a right thing does not make the things that preceded it less true. Victor stopped. He held his right hand out toward Reyes, palm facing sideways, the way you offered a hand to someone you were choosing to meet as an equal. Reyes looked at the hand for half a second. He took it. They shook. Victor said, "You did the right thing, Sergeant," Reyes said. "I should have done it sooner." Victor looked at him steadily. "You did it," Victor said. "That's what counts." He released the hand and walked the last 12 feet to the driver's door. He opened it. He reached up and took the dog tags between his right thumb and forefinger and pressed them flat back under the collar of the gray t-shirt, settling them back against his sternum in their proper position. The position they had held for 30 years, in every country and every condition he had ever operated in. The position they would continue to hold through every country and condition that remained. He got in the truck. He authorized the pump on his card from the app on his phone. He filled the tank. He replaced the nozzle, closed the fuel door, settled back into the driver's seat, and put the truck in drive. He pulled out of the Exxon on Meridian Road at 4:47 in the afternoon and turned north, and the road ahead was clear. And the light was the warm angled light of late afternoon in early autumn, and Victor drove into it with both hands on the wheel.
What you just watched is fiction, but the question at the center of it is not. A man who spent 30 years serving his country was treated on an ordinary afternoon at a gas station, as though that service did not exist, as though the uniform he once wore had never been real or had never been his. The question is not whether that kind of afternoon can happen. The question is why it keeps happening to the people who earned the right, more than most, to never have to prove themselves again. Black Americans have served in every war the United States has ever fought. In the Revolutionary War, roughly 5,000 black men took up arms for a country that legally enslaved most of them. In the Civil War, nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors served in the Union Army, fighting in a conflict whose outcome would determine whether their families remained property or became people. In World War I, more than 350,000 black Americans served overseas, many of them in segregated units, assigned to the most dangerous labor details, denied the medals their white counterparts received for the same actions. In World War II, the number exceeded 1 million. The Tuskegee Airmen flew more than 15,000 sorties in European skies. The Buffalo Soldiers served in campaigns across 4 continents. The numbers are not small. The sacrifice is not theoretical. What these men came home to was a different kind of war. After World War I, the summer of 1919 became known as the Red Summer, a wave of racial violence across more than 30 American cities in which black veterans, still wearing their uniforms, were attacked, lynched, and killed. The uniform did not protect them. It sometimes made them targets. White mobs and law enforcement operated, in many cases, with the same basic logic. A black man in a position of authority or dignity was an affront to the order the war had not changed. The Double V campaign of World War II gave that logic a name. Black newspapers and soldiers coined the phrase to describe what they were fighting for: victory abroad against fascism, and victory at home against the racisms that structured American life. They won the First War. The second one was considerably longer. The GI Bill of 1940 was intended to lift returning veterans into the middle class. Low-interest mortgages, education benefits, business loans. For white veterans, it worked as designed. For black veterans, it was administered by local officials who denied applications, by banks that refused loans in neighborhoods redlined off the map, by universities that turned away qualified applicants at the door. The benefits existed on paper. The paper had conditions. The conditions were race. Medgar Evers came home from Normandy. He had served in a unit that helped liberate Europe and had watched his country celebrate V-Day. He came home to Mississippi and could not vote. He was 20 years old. He spent the rest of his short life organizing toward a country that matched what he had fought for, and in 1963 he was shot in his driveway by a man who was acquitted twice before a jury finally convicted him decades later. Evers was 37 years old when he died. He had been wearing his uniform the day he decided he would not accept what he came home to. The uniform had not protected him either. What does it mean to carry that history into the present? It means that when a black veteran is pulled from his truck on an ordinary afternoon, he is not simply in a difficult moment. He is in a continuum. He is standing at the end of a very long line of men who put on a uniform, went where the country sent them, did what the country asked, and came home to find that the country's guarantee did not extend to gas stations, or driveways, or voting booths, or quiet afternoons. The debt owed to those men was never settled. The reckoning was deferred, and then deferred again. And what remains is still here on a Tuesday afternoon in a gas station in Virginia, written in the specific patience of a man who has learned not to expect the country to recognize what it owes him, but who has not stopped being owed. Some debts accumulate interest. The cost of carrying them is paid by the person who should have been repaid.